Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 8, The Bible, Slavery, and You. Just a heads up that the interview portion of this episode contains some fairly direct and frank discussions of the realities of slavery and the treatment of women in antiquity, which includes things like sexual assault and violence against women. A couple of minor corrections at the top. Last time, I mentioned that pre-exilic Hebrew was called Paleo-Hebrew, and while I have seen it referred to as such, apparently what many scholars now prefer is to call pre-exilic Hebrew Old Hebrew, and delineate between a few forms of that script. The term Paleo-Hebrew is usually reserved for post-exilic writing that aims to archaize itself and present itself as older than it is, similar to how one might write Ye Olde Shop at a Ren Fair, or use a black-letter Gothic script to give something an aged Germanic look. I guess that's more of a minor correction and a clarification, but still, I try to be precise on this show, so I will always make sure to correct and clarify if and when I make mistakes. Anyway, moving on. In today's episode, we're talking briefly about the reign of David's son Solomon, picking up where we left off last episode, as well as slavery in both literature and reality. To help us through all of this, I've brought on Dr. Joshua Bowen to discuss slavery in ancient West Asia. Josh is a wonderful Assyriologist, and along with his wife and past Bible Lore podcast guest Megan Lewis, he's one half of the Digital Hammurabi team. Josh has also written the extremely helpful guidebook, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery?, which is about exactly what its title suggests. Josh's book, along with all other sources, will be listed in the description of this episode, and you can listen to our full interview on patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. Last time, we looked a bit at the historical King David, whatever we can actually find about him, and the legendary tales of the formation of the monarchies of Israel and Judah, how these would give authorization to Judahites to claim the northern kingdom for themselves, even if the reality on the ground of this great kingdom would not realistically be realized to any extent until the time of Herod the Great, about a millennium after these events were set and several centuries after they were written. In 2 Samuel, after he becomes king, David drives out the Jebusites from the city of Jerusalem and sets up shop with the small town as his new capital. Over the rest of the story, he rarely does much right. He's a terrible father and often an impious follower of Yahweh. And by the time he's dead, he's basically portrayed as an invalid, unable to even sleep with a girl who's brought into his bedchambers. This sexual impotency and his bedridden status are literary motifs used to emphasize his inability to rule and the need for a new king, which ends up being one of his sons, Solomon, a young and virile man, in contrast to his father, taking over from one who's lost favor with his people and his God, much like David took over from Saul before him. Something curious about the biblical narrative in 2 Samuel, though, is its insistence that despite the rumors to the contrary, Solomon is in fact David's son and the rightful heir to the throne. See, earlier in the book, David spies a woman bathing across the street, basically doing a little bit of rear window style voyeurism while an entire harem of Grace Kellys hangs out behind him. But he wants the bathing woman, Bathsheba, and so he orders her to be brought to him, and he sleeps with her, claiming her as his own. When she becomes pregnant, he orders her husband, his commander Uriah, to come home and have sex with his wife. Uriah refuses, noting that this would be impious. It violates all of the laws of holy warfare. David orders him to the front lines, sending him with secret orders that instruct his soldiers to fall back during battle. The soldiers obey their king, and Uriah is struck down. This whole tale seems to be the first layer of apologetic to deny that it's possible for Uriah to have been Solomon's father. But a later writer noticed that this narrative relies on the implication that Uriah couldn't have had sex with his wife while he was home, which is basically just a, trust me bro, it didn't happen. This wasn't convincing enough for this redactor, who sought to close the potential loophole, and created an even bigger horror show in the process. So in the narrative as we have it, Yahweh is infuriated by David's actions and kills the baby that Bathsheba gives birth to. This reassures the reader that even if Uriah did have sex with his wife, Solomon couldn't be his son, because obviously that baby was killed by Yahweh. This makes Yahweh seem like a pretty terrible bastard, punishing Bathsheba and her baby for something that wasn't their fault, but rather David's. Because of this, a popular reinterpretation by more recent pastors, especially among conservative evangelicals, is that Bathsheba must have been slutting it up at the baths, and therefore it wasn't only David's sin. She must have been asking for it in some way and tempting him. That, of course, is even more awful, and still leaves God responsible for killing an innocent baby, but the concerns of women and babies have never been evangelicals' strong suit. So anyway, Bathsheba gives birth to another of David's sons, Solomon. Baden notes that Solomon's name, potentially meaning something like his replacement, now refers not to replacing Uriah, but to replacing the unnamed baby boy that Yahweh killed. But that's also assuming Solomon is a real person. If he's entirely fictitious, which is an outside possibility, then the name Solomon is invented as part of the narrative. If he's not, and he was a real person and a real king, which seems fairly likely, then his name could instead refer to the god Shalem, or Shalim. Either way, in a complicated series of events, all of David's older sons from his other wives are killed or pushed aside, clearing the way for the replacement to become the king, whether he was David's son or not. Solomon is said to have been the most majestic king of all Judahite and Israelite history. He's given the honor of having built the Jerusalem temple, expanded his kingdom from the Euphrates even to the Gazan coast. He acquires an enormous harem of foreign wives to cement his regional political ties to the great empires that surrounded the Levant. And these horrible foreign wives are blamed for influencing Solomon into abandoning Yahweh-only worship and worshiping their foreign gods. Much later texts go on to make Solomon even more interesting as the founder of an entire school of magic that would continue to be influential into the late medieval period, and his legend as a glorious statesman lived on in his 16th century Ottoman namesake, the legendary Sultan Silbermann the Magnificent. If we have only the slightest hint in the historical record that David existed, Solomon and his immediate successors are a black hole. Despite allegedly marrying so many foreign royal wives from Africa to Afghanistan to cement alliances with all of these great kingdoms, his name does not appear even a single time in the historical record. The reality on the ground is that there was no glorious Solomonic kingdom, and most of the monumental building works that early archaeologists attributed to Solomon have since been determined to be a bit later, and entirely confined to the northern kingdom of Israel, at a time where even the biblical texts confess that the kingdom was split, and that the north was more of a significant regional polity. At the same time, the association of Solomon with Jerusalem is an interesting one because of the potential similarities between the theophoric elements in the names of David's sons, Solomon and Absalom. Shalem was the goddess of the evening star, the planet Venus. In the Ugaritic texts, there's a sort of ritual/myth referred to as the birth of the gracious and beautiful gods, or more simply, the lovely gods. The text is about our old friend, the original god of Israel, El, and it contains what appears to be instructions for a ritual feast at the start, followed by a story about El impregnating two of his wives, which features curious lines about how El couldn't get it up. Quote, "As for El, his staff drooped. As for El, his love shaft sank." But this ED doesn't last long, and with great concentration.
When a man loves a woman, and he actually wants to make love to her, something very, very special happens. And with deep concentration and great focus, he is often able to achieve in a...
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you.
El's staff rises once again, and he knocks up his wives, who give birth to Shachar and Shalim, dawn and dusk. So they're both Venus, I guess, because it's the morning star and the evening star. I don't know how that works. I've never gotten into astrology. If someone wants to explain it, the email address is bibleorpodcast@gmail.com. Anyway, the story from there goes on to describe El's seed producing more children who are, unlike Shachar and Shalim, ravenous and who must be fed. And there's a whole feast. It's a strange tale. I'm not going to get into it. The name Shalim, however, has a semantic overlap with the word shalom, the root of the Hebrew greeting shalom, and the Arabic greeting assalamu alaikum. And this complicates our ability to be certain that Solomon was named after Shalem. Obviously, the city of Jerusalem is a very important part of that factor. It's entirely possible that, in the practice of the time, It's referring to parents who replaced a dead child with a new one and then utilized the element shalom. Shalamaya, for example, meaning Yahweh replaced. It's not an uncommon name at the time. On the other hand, the connection with Shalem would be supported by the naming of one of David's other sons, Absalom, meaning my father is the god Shalem, and with that, the name of the very city, Jerusalem. Additionally, Shalem was the one who Jerusalem and the city of Salem were both named after. Jerusalem had been a small town for most of the Late Bronze Age at least, likely with a shrine at the top of the hill where the first temple was built. Regardless of where one on the timeline places the writings of Samuel and Kings, it seems that whether within 1 century or 5 of whoever King David was, it was either unnoticed or considered completely unproblematic that he would have sons named after the god. Perhaps because it can and has been reinterpreted as his son instead being named after the related greeting and word for peace, shalom. This kind of ambiguity, once again, allowed for vestiges of older cultic practices in honor of later forbidden gods to survive to us today. So thank you to Shalom for obscuring the evening star. We would be just a little poorer without her. Speaking of the temple, Solomon is said to have built it, the famous Jerusalem temple, and his description in the text is fairly questionable, reflecting more of an idealized and significantly exaggerated version. But here's the thing. If David and Solomon didn't oversee a glorious and united monarchy, if buildings and works attributed to them previously have instead been dated decades or even centuries after their deaths, then what can we even say about Solomon's temple? The problem, of course, is that the temple's location at a major current holy site makes it impossible to do excavations, which is unfortunate, but obviously there are more important things in life than my silly little podcast. But despite archaeology being a bit of a dead end, a point made by scholars is that the temple site on the grounds of what is now Al-Aqsa Mosque compound are on the local hilltop, in the most logical place to build a temple, reasonably close to a water source at the highest point in the area. That's where you build the royal temple and palace. As the type of temple Solomon is said to have built bears more resemblance to late Bronze Age temples than later Iron Age temples, it's fairly plausible that the building itself predated the Israelites, or rather Judahites. See, Urushalim is attested as a city throughout the late Bronze Age, with mentions in Egypt starting in the time of Hammurabi, and it seems to have had significant fortifications during some of this period. Frevel notes that it would almost be implausible if it didn't have some kind of central sanctuary or shrine to serve the local petty king. And again, the most logical spot for such a shrine or temple is, well, where the temple is said to have been built. Additionally, Solomon's temple is said to have faced east. Maybe Yahweh wasn't the first sun-related god worshipped in what we now call Solomon's temple. But for now, that's the best we can do, and it's a bit speculative. Solomon, however, and forgive this pun, flew a little too close to the sun according to the text, and his own splendor turns out to be the downfall of his united kingdom. He's said to have put the northerners under a harsh forced labor system to build his magnificent storage cities and monumental works. This is typically referred to as a corvee-style labor system. The backlash to this pressing into service is what is ultimately credited with the splitting of the kingdoms. The leader of the laborers, Jeroboam, is told by a prophet that he will take Israel, and so he flees Israel to escape Solomon's attempts on his life. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam makes conditions even worse for the forced laborers, and so the northern tribes of Israel secede, and Jeroboam is made their king. So while this story didn't happen, and in fact may be a reversal of a story where the North forced the Southern laborers to build their monumental works, it does give us a chance to talk about forced labor and slavery, which were and are very real things, as most folks are probably aware. This podcast is not primarily concerned with quote-unquote misinformation about the Bible, and for good reason. I find the entire enterprise of fact-checking and countering misinformation to be mostly ineffective and at worst misguided. If stating, "Nuh-uh, human-caused climate change is real," and showing the data to prove it was an effective strategy, we would not be staring down the barrel of the beginning of a second Donald Trump presidency. People mostly don't believe nonsense because of misinformation being spread in a vacuum and then their reasoning misfires, but instead because it already slots into their worldview or their greater political project. And because of that, fact-checking and counter-apologetics or counter-misinformation, it can help sometimes, but they don't magically make the problem go away. So all of that said, there is still a lot of misinformed bullshit out there about slavery in the Bible. And while in our interview, Josh often refers to these views, the main point of this episode, and indeed this entire show, is instead to give a straightforward reconstruction of the history and mythology and lore of the Bible, not as a reaction to conservative understandings of this history, or even worse, fundamentalist understandings, but is something that can stand on its own. If you Google anything about the Bible, the first results, courtesy of overwhelming funding and SEO manipulation, will be swamped with evangelical and conservative Christian websites, and biblical slavery is no exception. You will find websites that tell you that biblical slavery wasn't so bad, that they took care of their slaves and treated them like family, and that it was nothing like antebellum American chattel slavery. I would like to instead talk about what's actually in the Bible. But as I noted before, don't expect to be able to merely send this episode to someone who's fully convinced the Bible's the most perfectest thing ever written and have them admit that it has some pretty heinous stuff in it that is interesting historically but shouldn't be used as a straightforward guide to life today. Your friend, if you send it to him, most likely won't budge. I'm not saying that to discourage you from sharing the show. I mean, please do. But understand it's not a miracle cure. So, all those caveats in mind, let's talk about that most cheerful of topics, slavery. Slavery and forced labor have been part of the human story for a very long time. Not forever, but certainly since the emergence of whatever the early version of a political entity looked like. If you have weapons and can conquer, you can force people to do things that they don't want to do. While forced labor still exists today, we've abstracted it to a certain extent. I mean, consider stories of Filipino teachers and nurses on H-1B visa programs in America. These primarily women teachers are lured with promises of a better life in the United States by certain Filipino agencies which work with American counterparts in the education or nursing sphere. The idea is that the teachers will be able to send money back to their families, at least from the teacher's perspective. The agencies state that they'll handle the paperwork. The prospective teachers are sent to America, crowded into bunk beds at homes and apartments that are undoubtedly over capacity. Their passports are taken for safekeeping, and then, surprise, they're told they owe a massive debt to the agency. Sometimes the jobs they were promised don't even exist. Now they're trapped in America without their passports, and most of their wages are garnished by the agency. And of course, there's the infamous 13th Amendment, where slavery was abolished unless you're incarcerated. These primarily racial and ethnic minority carceral slaves were used to fight the 2025 California fires that were still being contained when I started writing this, and failed presidential candidate Kamala Harris, in her former role as California's Attorney General, fought to keep the system that pressed these inmates into service and paid the equivalent of a couple dollars an hour, depending on how you calculate it. Harris later distanced herself from the effort, but little has changed and the incarcerated firefighters press on. So we're very good as a species at justifying slavery, especially when it's an other we're dealing with. Abstracting the humanity of the person you're enslaving is critical to ensuring that most of the well-to-do folks in society don't feel empathy for those pressed into labor and can enjoy the advantages built on their backs. It usually needs to be the poor, or the foreigner, or the criminal, or the ethnic or racial minority, or, as Josh and I discuss at length, women. People who the wealthy and those just below them can look at and say, hey, they probably deserved whatever got them into their status as a slave. That's how it works today, and that's how it has always worked. In our first episode, I talked about the poorest in Hammurabi's time selling themselves into debt slavery. And when folks talk about biblical slavery, That's what they primarily focus on, and some apologists even try to claim that that was the only kind of slavery that the Bible allowed, which isn't true. The Bible allows and endorses chattel slavery, but specifically only of non Israelites and non Judahites, the other. These slaves would have been taken in battle as spoils. So every time you read about conquest in the Bible and the spoils taken after a battle, remember that it's not just physical possessions, it's people too. But how do the laws we find and the practices we see described in the Bible compare to the cultures around ancient West Asia? Is the Bible better, worse, or about the same as their contemporary neighbors? To answer these questions, let's turn to my interview with Dr. Josh Bowen. Now, this might seem like an obvious question. What is slavery? When we're talking about slavery, for example, in the old world, what does that mean?
Yeah, actually, it sounds like a simple question, but it's actually fairly complicated. So, in the same way that if you were to ask, what does the word run mean? It depends, right? It depends on the context in which it's being used. One of the things that we see in the ancient Near East in general, and certainly this is true in the Hebrew Bible, is that one main word, at least for males, is used to indicate a slave. So you have a wardum or a wardu in Akkadian, and you have in Hebrew an eved, and those words in Akkadian and in Hebrew do an awful lot of legwork. So I guess I guess maybe if we think about the word boss, we could say, as Michael Scott did, I love my boss. Those shoulder pads are really boss.
Right.
That
So
perm is
Bruce
really boss.
Springsteen, he's the boss, et
He's the
cetera, et
boss.
cetera.
Well, they blew up a chicken man in Philly last night.
And so I think that the way that I define slavery in the book, it's notoriously difficult to,
Right.
to define because of this. But I think in the context in which we use it here online or in these discussions with apologists, is it's one person owning another person as property, either temporarily or permanently. And temporary slaves are generally debt slaves or pledges. Those individuals that are still considered to be free under the law, or that they will eventually go back to their state of freedom, but they're just temporarily in this state of servitude. And usually there's a time limit that the law collections sort of set on how long somebody could be a debt slave. Once someone is converted into a chattel slave, a slave that is property, that is a permanent status. Generally speaking, there is no rule that they have to be released after a certain period of time. And usually, treatment of a chattel slave can be more severe, physical, and uh, those sorts of aspects, because now they're considered strict property as opposed to like temporary property.
Right. There's no threat in the owner's mind of, for example, well, not even threat, but reality of after this person gets out, I may have to interact with them in some capacity as in any way an equal. This person is forever of a lower status than me. There is no chance that they will return to anything in polite society that would require me to treat them in any way politely. It is, and I think this is an important point you bring up in your book. When the Bible does talk about slavery, especially with how it treats Hebrew versus foreign slaves, it makes a clear distinction that this is not something that you want to be. And yet, you know,
Mhm.
there it is. They're allowed to take foreign slaves, and it is incredibly likely that they did so.
Yeah, and I mean, well, I think we're going to talk about this, but
Mhm.
it's it's sometimes difficult to ascertain in ancient Israel what happened historically, because our primary source, right, is the Hebrew Bible, and that can be challenging
It's
to
late,
utilize
it's
as a source.
redacted, several a lot of sources combined. It is the definition of fraught.
But I think we can have make a good go of it
And
to try to get at some things. So
yeah, and I think that's where the comparative aspects can take us a long way. So that really speaks to the fact that, Exodus 20 and 21, the covenant code very specifically seem to be, well, I guess you can describe it. How do they relate to Hammurabi's code?
Yeah, so that's tricky. The different scholars take different approaches to that. Some people, like Wright, would say it's almost like a direct borrowing from what we see in the laws of Hammurabi. Others would say, yeah, I don't know that it's a direct borrowing, but certainly it's dependent upon it in the sense that it's part of a wider cultural tradition, and it sort of was one of the law collections that sort of stirred up and created that cultural tradition. I tend to think closer to Wright's position, that there's probably more commonality than less. But yeah, one of the things that we can certainly say is that the Hebrew Bible, particularly the Covenant Code, continues on a tradition that we see, beginning as early as the third millennium in Mesopotamia, and that is the law collection. So you have the early laws of Or Nama that come from around 2100 BCE, and you have the laws of Lipit-Ishtar, the laws of Eshnunna, the laws of Hammurabi, the Middle Assyrian laws, and so on.
Question I had is, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, are we able to tease apart the difference between the literary ideals and the reality when it comes to slavery specifically?
Yeah, I think in some cases, so let me see if I can't paint the broader problem here. It was assumed early on that when you are looking at Exodus 21, for example, and it says, if you purchase a male slave, he'll serve for 6 years, he'll go out in the seventh. That well, this was just the law of the land, right? They thought this was normative legislation. This was something that was promulgated, and so sort of maybe a little mechanistically, but or over literally, but the picture is sort of the judge sitting there at the city gate, and Frank the Israelite comes up and says, "Hey, Bob took my sheep," right?
Right.
And he won't give it back, and now I'm taking him to court on this. I'm taking him to the judges, and the judge turns around and says, "All right, let me see what the covenant code says about this." Right? What? So let me say,
We just dust it
okay,
off. Yeah.
yeah, right. Well, it says here that you're supposed to pay 30 shekels of silver, right? So that's what we're going to do. Slam the gavel and move on. Like that's not obviously how that was done, and of course, part of the part of the reason that this sort of began to develop is scholars like Krauss and Jean Botero and others started to make observations about other Near Eastern, particularly Akkadian texts that seem to have a similar structure to what we see in these law collections. So, law collections are generally, not always, but generally formulated if X happens, then Y is sort of if then. And they call that casuistic law. And of course, if people are familiar with the Hebrew Bible, they are familiar. They say, "Oh, that sounds really familiar. If this, then that." And what scholars began to notice is that there are lots of texts that follow that same sort of pattern. So, medicinal texts, for example, if the patient is red in the face, then it is skin disease, right? Or
Yeah.
if he and if
Omen
there
text
are
too. If
yes,
if your child is born with a wolf's head, then there
that's
will be
correct.
calamity in the land.
That's correct. And this, there are
I
lots of
stole that from
things
your
that
book, by the way. That's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not.
no,
I
and
didn't
then
just. I didn't just stumble upon that one. It was a good one.
I stole it from Akkadian Omina. So, where it's just a long line going back. But one of the things that sort of piqued everyone's interest here is that a lot of these texts are also found in scribal curriculum context, scribal training context of scribal training. And so, this adds another layer of complication because the Hebrew Bible, we don't have that sort of primary context because, as you said, we're looking at much later manuscripts that have been redacted that are starting to be sort of stitched together in some cases, whereas we're having to and so we're having to sort of project back theoretically what is it that how did this come together, whereas with Akkadian and Sumerian texts, like we have the tablets, right?
Write
So you
your
can
shit on
see.
stone. Write
That's
it
right,
on
everybody.
stone. Don't write it on goddamn animal skins because nobody's
That's
going to be
right.
able to find it in 3,000 years.
That's right. So, there are debates still. There's no consensus that I know of in ancient Near Eastern and Hebrew Bible amongst the law specialists there. People are interested in this. Bruce Wells is a phenomenal resource. So he works on this. So the question sort of is like, what are these? What are these texts? And now that's a complicated question that we don't really have consensus on at the moment. However, there are some views like maybe they were just scribal exercises. And if they were scribal exercises, maybe they were scribes that were sitting and thinking, what do we think the law should be? Or maybe they're not thinking about how the law should be at all. Maybe they're just coming up with cases to try to practice, law vocabulary. So there are lots of different ideas. There are ideas about wisdom literature. Is it more akin to wisdom literature? So it's like the way that would lead to your best life, living your best life.
Yeah.
But they're not like rules that are authoritative and normative and enforced by a police, or by a an external force of the state or something. All of these options are debated, right?
Yeah.
And so what a Christian apologist will do is they will say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! You just read to me a law about how to buy slaves, but don't you know anything about ancient Near Eastern law? These weren't normative legislation. These weren't the laws of the land. These were more like wisdom. It's more like suggestions that maybe, but there's certainly you can't say that Yahweh gave these laws. Now, the problem, if the listener hasn't picked up on it yet, the problem with that view is that if you believe that Yahweh actually came down on Mount Sinai and handed Moses these commandments and delivered the 613 laws, well, it's kind of tough to then say, "Thus says Yahweh, if you don't do these things, I will destroy you." That they're not things that they had to do, right? It doesn't really work that way. The reason that scholars today can say we don't think these were normative legislations because they don't think there was a Yahweh that came down on Mount Sinai and handed
Right.
them down.
There's kind of two aspects of it that become problematic. One is that there is something different about the way that the law codes function in the Bible. And this is something that people have picked up on as a sort of innovation of the Hebrew Bible, especially the Torah. The idea that it's actually, instead of, for example, Shema handing Hammurabi the kind of authority to give his law code, in this case, it's ascribing the law code itself to having come from Yahweh, from his actual own mouth. It is this kind of, I don't remember which scholar actually mentioned that. I know that the idea though is that it's an innovation. It is something unique and I think pretty fascinating about these ancient scribes, these ancient Yahwists, is the idea that they actually take it a step further. And if there's any comparison to Atenism, to Akhenaten and how he conceived his cult, it's that even bigger closeness. Now, for Aten or Akhenaten, it was between him and the god alone. Everyone else had to pray to Akhenaten. He was the big dog now. But for them, it was kind of something different. It was the idea that now it's not the king anymore. It's actually God himself. It is Yahweh, the chief God, the big dog upstairs, who is the one actually writing these things down. And it creates kind of this contradiction within it where now you have to address, sure, these previous ones may have had flaws, but now you're kind of stuck with it. Like, right there, now these people have to actually reason with the implications of, well, oh shit, he said what about
Yeah.
you can't ever free a woman slave? Huh?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's why it's important to be able to recognize There are a lot of, I'm trying to choose my words carefully here.
You're
There are a
good.
lot of what I consider to be well meaning online Christian apologists. And I think they're very intelligent. The problem is that they're not trained in the field. And because of that, it can be very difficult at times to really wrap one's head around arguments that scholars are making, particularly when those arguments are in academic journals
Yeah.
or in monographs. And because of that, it's easy to walk away thinking, I understand what Jeffrey Stackert is arguing here, or I understand what Bruce Wells is arguing, or I understand Joel Baden's
Yeah.
argument. And it sometimes isn't quite that simple. And because they're not afraid to hold minority, sometimes fringe positions in the academic world, because they can write that off as, oh, those are just critical scholars that are holding that position. Uh, it's easy, it's much easier, I think, to come up with an apologetic argument that nobody's writing about and not worry about that, because
Right.
it's those critical scholars that aren't going to hold to this. So I think we need to be wary of that.
One of the approaches that you address is the idea that there's this progressive revelation, which would seem to conflict with that view. But it's the idea that, uh, yeah, God was okay with slavery because humans were so bad, and there's some New Testament scripture that backs that up. You know, Jesus teaching on divorce in, I think, Matthew. The idea that he says in the one of the synoptic gospels that yes, God let Moses tell you that divorce is okay because you were evil and wicked, and he just had to do it. How does that line up with the Hebrew Bible and then in the New Testament? Is there any there? Is that actually something? Is there any indication that there is some movement against slavery as you chronologically progress through the Bible or through the history of the Bible, or however people want to slice that?
Yeah. I think it's so that everybody understands what's being said or what's being argued. It's that there's a form of divine accommodation going on. And so, God comes down under this theory and says, "Oh gracious, for better or for a lack of a better term, these people, things are really screwed up, and their economy, for example, requires this social institution in order to maintain. So I can't just go ripping it away from them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a little bit better. Right? They use the term regulate. I'm going to regulate slavery laws because everybody's doing it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if you're going to do it, you're going to do it better. And that's going to, along with other verses that they bring into the discussion, that's going to start the people thinking, ooh, maybe owning people as property bad. So there are a couple of hurdles that I find difficult to get over with this argument. First, and probably foremost, is that if this were the case, the one thing that the way that I would expect to see this is that all of the laws about slavery would either be morally the same, like not morally worse, or better than what we see in the rest of the ancient Near East. That's what I would
I mean,
expect.
it's a scientific way to approach it. If you
Yeah.
want to test the claim, let's see what we can observe. Let's look at it and see how we do. How do we do?
Yeah. So, I mean, just so it's clear, to give like an example, another example that might be easier to grasp here. If I were trying to get my family eating better, and we were having Pop Tarts for breakfast, Pop Tarts for lunch, and Pop Tarts for dinner. Well, I might not want to just rip Pop Tarts away from them.
Yeah,
So what?
they have withdrawals. They get all shaky.
Right.
You know.
So what I might do is I might say, okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna say Pop Tarts for breakfast, Pop Tarts for lunch, but we're going to have a nice healthy dinner, right?
Mix in a salad.
That's right. And then maybe, 6 months later, hey, you know what? We're gonna start, making the Pop-Tart lunch go away. We're gonna try to have some vegetables and,
Yeah.
in other words, even though breakfast and lunch in the beginning remain the same, what what I'm doing is I'm moving a little bit ahead, right? If that's what we saw, what I wouldn't expect to see though is, okay, we're going to have Skittles for breakfast, Pop Tarts for lunch, and salad for dinner. I wouldn't expect to see one go less healthy.
Right. You wouldn't expect a full strength soda to slip into the menu.
That's right. You would expect it to either stay the same or be better. So if we translate that into what we expect from the Hebrew Bible, if let's say the law of the land is like in the laws of Hammurabi, if you come to the laws of Hammurabi and it says if somebody becomes a debt slave, you're only allowed to keep them for 3 years. And in the fourth year, you have to set them free with their debt completely repaid. Well, if I turn to the Hebrew Bible, I would expect that if there were a law about debt slavery, that it would be 3 years or less. I wouldn't expect it to be more, but that's what we see in the Hebrew Bible, right? And I think that's a hurdle that's very difficult to overcome because if you're trying to make this statement that God is improving, it doesn't matter that on some of them he's better, although those are very few and far between. If some are worse, that seems to be antithetical, right? It seems to really be an undermining defeater, or at least, again, a major hurdle that someone would have to contend with. So, this is sort of what we see in the law collections of the ancient Near East in general. It's some places on slavery, they're a little bit better. Some places they're a little bit worse. But on the whole, they just kind of are a wash, right? They're all kind of doing the same thing. So what is reasonable? Now, I'm not a moral ethicist. I mean, a moral philosopher or an ethicist. So, like I don't have a lot of skin in the game here, and I don't have a lot of expertise in moral theory, really any at all. But the what I can do is I can look at the way that the text of the Hebrew Bible, texts of the New Testament in the early church, what we can see and how thought developed concerning this practice. And the reality here is there's not a lot of change, right? So if you listen to apologists like Cliff Knechtle, there's some sort of some standard texts in the New Testament that they're going to go to. First, when you ask them about slavery in the Hebrew Bible, they're going to go to Genesis 1:26. Wow, we're created in God's image, and so we have value.
That's
It's
right.
not it's not really
They
what that
they
text
hey,
is doing,
they
but
they started off the Constitution with that, like it was right in there, right? So they definitely treated everyone the same, and
yeah,
that
right? I mean,
that
come
that
on.
functions just like it says on the right in the book.
That's right.
I read it all in the Trump Bible.
The gracious. Um, and then they, go to, the Exodus, the fact that, God is
Yeah,
bringing people,
he
saving them
says,
from
I
slavery.
we you shall never enslave a fellow Hebrew. That is an explicit command. I don't remember exactly how it's worded, but I mean the idea that's kind of the next point is when they get out of slavery, he says, "You'll never be slaves again." The key word there, you.
Yeah, and it doesn't
Who's
happen at
in
first, right?
yeah, right. And who's
Miss
in
that?
view for
That's right.
you?
That's right. And so then what they do is they'll read Leviticus 19:33 to 34. Don't oppress a foreigner, living in your midst, love him as yourself. Oh, well, you can't, if you can't oppress somebody, you certainly can't enslave them. Well, it doesn't really work that way. But then they jump ahead to the New Testament. They'll quote Galatians 3:28, right? There's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all one in the body of Christ. Well, I mean, gracious, if there's neither slave nor free, I mean, it's equality. Well, yeah. So are you super woke? Because there's neither male nor female. Hey, awesome.
That's
If you're
great.
so if you don't have any real steps at all taken toward eliminating the social institution of slavery in the Hebrew Bible. You don't have any real steps at all taken in the New Testament text toward eliminating the social institution of slavery. Then, if we go to the early church, you can read Jennifer Glancy and Ronald Charles on this. You find, nope, they're not really taking major steps. I think for 4 centuries, and it's not my area of expertise, but so I would definitely recommend reading Jennifer Glancy's book on that. But is that the most parsimonious explanation, that God was like moving people along a millimeter at a time for 2,600 years, 2,500
Right.
years, 20, I guess 2,400 years, only to like have it come out in the 19th century. Hello, hooray, finally, God has worked us out of slavery. Like, does that seem, if it does, hey, live your best life. But it's not a convincing argument to me.
Now, something interesting that kind of skirts the bounds of this, going back to ye old Communist Manifesto, they introduced the text by talking about social relations between slave and master, between the lord and the peasant, between the corvee and the landowner, basically, whatever it was, in depending on corvee labor, set up in a few different ways. And there is some truth to that, right? We can, I think it can be very crass, and I don't think it's helpful to compare things to slavery, because it's pretty bad. But there are these social relation aspects that I think a lot of apologists glom onto. One of the areas that I think is less discussed, because the term frankly isn't like used very much anymore, but is the idea of corvee labor. Solomon is stated to have essentially pressed the northern kingdom into service. Likely not true. It seems to be some sort of pious fiction. That's kind of the perspective that I think makes the most sense of the data, is the idea of, well, we used to rule over you guys, sort of thing. But corvee labor was a real thing. What is that, and how does it relate to slavery in the laws?
Yeah. So if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 20, there's a set of laws there, verses 10 to 14, that talk about what to do when they're settled in the land. What do you do with the cities that are afar off, right? Of course, the text after this is explicit that, remember, that's not the cities that are there in Canaan. Those all get wiped out, right?
Right.
But what about these cities that are not in the promised land? Because Deuteronomy sets up Israel as the head of the other nations, right? That's the way that this is supposed to work out. Israel is, the vassal to Yahweh, and then the other nations are to be vassals to Israel. So the marching orders, for lack of a better term, are to march up against the city and to offer it peace. Right? The Hebrew term that's used there is one that's familiar, I'm sure, to many of us, shalom. And it's, offer it peace, which sounds so pretty, right?
Yeah.
But if you see what actually happens, it's essentially vassal. It's a vassal treaty, right? They're going to be their vassals. And if you think about the Gibeonites, for example, in the book of Joshua, this is keeping right in line with what happened with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were actually inside of Canaan, and they saw what happened with Sihon and Og on the east side of the Jordan. They saw what happened with Jericho, saw what happened with Ai, and they went, uh,
Don't much
you
care
know,
for that.
yeah, we got to do something. And so they pretend to be from a distant land. And in so doing, because of what we see in Deuteronomy 20, this is sort of what's being played on here in, I think, the book of Joshua, is that there's this idea that cities outside of the land are able to become vassals. And so that's what's offered to the Gibeonites eventually. It can be our vassals. Well, and what that means is that they retain their free state, right? They get to live in their city. But whenever the king decides he wants some shit done, right? He wants to do a building project, or he wants some service maybe for the military or something, in support of efforts, he can go and say conscript, right? He can go and say, all right, give me 10,000 men or whatever. And they got to do it.
Right.
And so the Hebrew word for this is mas, MAS, and that's sort of the idea behind this. They can be pressed, as you said, pressed into service. So it's a temporary thing. Generally, it's seasonal, maybe, or again, for a particular project or something is sort of the idea. But this is not people being taken individually into somebody else's home to be kept as part of their inherited property and passed on to their children. This is something where it's a temporary diminished servitude, maybe is the right way to say that. Diminished, status where they enter into servitude, but generally for like a particular end, and
Yeah.
then they're released back.
Ideally, they're released back.
Ideally, that's right. And the reason that we see this sort of distinguishing feature, I suppose, is that what happens if the city does not accept that very generous
Yeah.
offer of peace?
What if they tell you to fuck off?
Yeah, that's right. If they close their gates and they put up a fight, then they're to lay siege to that city. And when
Yeah.
when Yahweh delivers them, they are to emasculate the city, right?
Yeah.
Kill all the men, and then they're to take the women and the children, the livestock, property, everything as plunder. And it's
Yep.
in this context that we see in Deuteronomy 21, if an Israelite male sees among the captives a beautiful woman and wants to
Yeah.
take her as a wife, here's how you do it. So, yeah, I mean, those people become slaves proper. They do go into people's households. They are divvied up. This is what we see in Numbers chapter 31.
And I guess for people to understand, these sorts of things are realities. The biblical notions of it largely were not on the scale that they discussed, nor even in the chronology that they discussed. But
Sure.
things like famously leading up to the War of 1812, one of the rallying cries was, "They are impressing our seamen." The British are impressing our seamen. We can't have our merchant marines out there getting pulled into British service. It is a thing that happened. So this is actually a social reality, even if we talk about it in these idealized ways. They are reflected in these laws because these are things that happen with somewhat regularity.
And this is the thing that maybe we should touch on. When I teach Hebrew, and when I teach, for example, certain vocabulary words, sometimes you have to nuance it. So, when you're translating and you see the Hebrew word uga, uga is translated cake. And so, here the prophet is, here it says, make me a cake. Well, you have to say, we should not be picturing happy birthday to you,
Right.
icing, candles, like the sweets. Or no, this is a bread cake,
Yeah,
right? It has a different meaning.
it's
So
probably some sort of unleavened bread if it's like what was described as cake until the invention of sodium bicarbonate and discovery of that sort of thing.
that's right. And so when the point is that there's a constellation of characteristics of features that often come to mind with particular words. And so when you hear cake as a 21st century, Westerner, you think, oh, icing and happy birthday. Those are the things that they come to your mind. And so you have to be careful when you're doing the work of translation to make sure that they don't go down that path. And I'm sure that someone has preached that on a Sunday morning, right?
Yep.
Here they ate the cake, and this was the birthday celebration.
Right.
Hallelujah. Okay.
I mean, the most
Um,
classic example of that is that every single sermon on the parable of the talents mentions that it mentions, well, it doesn't really mean talent, but we can make it mean that if we want to
yeah, that's
have
right.
this
We can make it
moral
mean it.
instruction.
That's
That
right.
is the exact sort of, like, I think that is probably the Platonic ideal of that sort of example
That's
of
right.
how these things, even when people know that, they will still sometimes
Yeah,
index, because those things are indexed in our meaning of the word. It
that's right.
becomes like almost inseparable in people's mind, and the temptation is not always avoided.
So if we take that very good methodological boundary when we come to translating ancient texts, that's a good thing. It gets weaponized by
Yeah.
apologists because apologists, what they say in the slavery context, they say, well, now, you've said the word slave. And I know that what's coming to your mind right now is the movie Roots and
Right.
all the atrocities that it's nothing like that in the Hebrew Bible, right? So we want to just get that notion right out of our heads. Well, you know, there's a certain amount of that you want to be cautious about, right? We don't want to say, well, it's not slavery if there's not the
You
master
know,
having the right
i-
to
if it
murder
if it
their
doesn't look
slave.
like Georgia in 1840 or something along those lines, right?
That's right. The problem is that there are many similarities between
Yeah,
slavery in the Hebrew Bible, the slave laws in the Hebrew Bible, and what we saw in the antebellum South. So apologists,
yeah,
what they want to do is they want to try to distance that word as much as they can. And the way that they do it is they start off almost invariably by saying, number one, not the antebellum South. Number two, it's mostly indentured servitude.
right.
Now, uh, thick flex, bruh, right, is
Yeah,
what I
really
wanna
great.
say.
Yeah,
So
right.
but what they do is indentured servitude, that sounds so much nicer
I mean,
than
there's
slavery.
so many syllables in that. How could it not
Right?
be
It's
nice? It's a completely different thing. It sounds so academic almost and sterile.
yeah, and I mean, like, servant, that sorta
Yeah,
seems like what I think of when I think of a butler, and
it,
I've seen Mr.
maze.
Belvedere,
Right,
right? And
right.
so that's what's going on here. And so, of course, that's all nonsense. So what we need to do when we talk about slavery in these contexts is not talk about what it's not. I think that's the key. What apologists want to do is give you a long list of what it's not, and they're usually not very specific.
Right.
What they're saying is it's not the bad slavery is what they're trying to say. But what they don't do is focus in on the dissimilarities specifically. They just say not like antebellum South. That's super bad, not that. The problem is that it is super bad,
Yeah.
right? And so what I tend to do in these contexts is say, let's talk about what it is.
Yeah.
So, what is debt slavery? Debt slavery is seen very clearly in 2 Kings 4:1, right? Where Elisha is called on by the widow woman, and she says, my husband took out a loan, he died, and now the creditor is coming to enslave to take my two sons as his slaves, right? As debt slaves.
Yeah.
It's not like she's saying, whew, man,
Thank God.
thank God, thank Yahweh above that
Yeah.
the creditor is coming to take my two sons. Boy, I tell you, I was a
I'm
little
so
worried about how I was going to feed
I
them.
I was really worried that I would be transported through time and space into the antebellum South in
Right.
1850. And one of the other things that I think you get into is that I think is particularly I don't care about whether it's defensible to an apologist or not. To me, their positions are immaterial. Could not give a shit less for the most part. But
Right.
one of the points that I think in that reality is the treatment of women in slavery. And I guess can you talk a bit about that and how in these differentiations between all of these different types of slavery, mostly what they're talking about seems to be male slaves. And
Yeah.
if it's a really good treatment and the best you can get is a debt slave, the finest debtor's prison in 1600s England, the whole accoutrement, they've even got PS2s there. Um,
Right.
does that apply to women?
No. And so, one of the things that I think people miss about debt slaves in the Hebrew Bible, as they were in the wider ancient Near East, is they're available for their sexual capacities.
Yeah.
So when you
The
look at
men and the women.
men and the women, that's right. So if you
Right.
look at Exodus 21, 2 to 6, it's very interesting the things that move into the background. So things that are focused on in those 5 verses are okay. Male slave. Well, he's gone into debt. So what's he going to do?
And it was
He's just
probably
got
his
to
own
sell
moral
himself.
choices that put him there, right?
That's exactly right.
There's no such thing as a social force. There's definitely not ridiculously fucked economic systems where the quotas they were expected to meet were completely unrealistic. None of those things could happen. Barring all of that,
So, the male debt slave boy, he's being given a way to work that debt off. Isn't that nice? And so then it's sort of the reading gets a little, they kind of move a little quick over those verses. And then but if the slave says, I love my master, oh, love him, just want to serve him forever, then he can join up with the household. I mean, come on, Josh, how could you have a problem with this? Well, here's what gets lost in the background, gets shoved into the background. The text says that if an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, sells himself to an Israelite, he serves for 6 years and is released in the seventh. Comes in alone, goes out alone. If he comes in with a wife, his wife goes out with him. If he comes in alone and his master gives him a wife, master gives him a wife, that's a slave.
Yeah.
Right. And they have children together. When the man, when the debt slave, when his 6 years is up, he goes out free, but his wife and his children are the property, the chattel slaves of the master. That's what goes into the background. Nobody thinks about that poor woman, those poor children.
And the question is there any regulation of what happens to her after this male Hebrew debt slave? Sorry, let's get all the qualifiers in there. After he has, in the most idealized version of this, where they're honoring this jubilee, which we know wasn't honored, but in the most idealized version of this, what happens to her if he leaves?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know that the text. I don't think the text considers it, and that's one of the downfalls I think of, or the not the downfalls, but the frustrating things about casuistic law is that it's meant to talk about the things that it's meant to talk about, and it's difficult to make inferences past that at times. But those are the wife and the children are chattel slaves. Paul Copan in his book and in his lectures will make this statement. Well, the guy can go out and work and wait for his wife and children to finish paying off, to finish their 6 years of service.
Yeah. Well,
They're
the
not
kids
debt
shouldn't have
slaves.
gotten into debt. They shouldn't have spent so much on Robux.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
V-Bucks.
they bought that
Right?
Super Nintendo, and
they've been playing too much Fortnite. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line here is that male debt slave is being used for his sexual capacities.
Yeah.
He's being used by the slave master there.
He's a stud. I mean, not to put it too crassly, but it's true.
That's right.
They are using them like you would with cattle. And that's what they did. It's not unique to Israel. It's not unique to the Bible. That is how the elites and the wealthy treated people. And so these women, they don't get that option. They are treated as being able to continue to produce more workers for these farms and for these different places of employment.
So when you think then about verses 7 through 11 and the Amah, the female slave, this is a situation, again, the apologist will focus on certain aspects, right? Look, being given as a wife, right? Is it, the difficulty, without going into all that detail, the difficulty with the term wife and its usage in the Hebrew Bible is that it's not a binary, right? You're either a wife or you're not. It doesn't function that way. There are gradations.
And I think Jennifer Bird's talked about
That's
this. Jennifer Nust has talked about this. The fact is that it functions more like German, if anyone's familiar with that. In German, the word for woman is Frau. The word for wife is Frau. The word for Mrs. is Frau. And that's the same sort of idea. Now, depending on the context, if it's his woman, his Frau, his Alma, or not what I can't remember the word, Ama. It's his woman, so you can kind of contextualize that it is a marital arrangement. But the word wife, again, is kind of fraught in a lot of these cases, because it does, for us, especially English speakers, it can really index a lot of things that are frankly not in view in this historical marriage context.
And I think, one of the problems is that we misunderstand, I think, in a fundamental way, what scholars mean when they say this law provision is a protection of the ama, the female slave, this
Right.
girl. It's a protection for her. It is. It's a protection for her. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing, right? Those
No.
two things are not the same. Ancient Near Eastern law, just like in most laws that I know of, protect the vulnerable party. That's why they're there. So that's not novel in the Hebrew Bible. And so here, this young girl is being sold by her father, quite literally, probably to pay off a debt. And there might be negotiations, but the father's probably not in a very good position to negotiate. And so, the guy is just sort of taking her in lieu of payment, some
Yeah.
other payment. Now, the thing is, once in this case, the female slave, she can also be used, obviously, for her sexual capacities. But once you do, part of the protection is that you have to change her status, right? She has to be, to use this terminology, she has to sort of be upgraded, right? Because with a man, his sexual capacity being used doesn't affect his value. With a woman, it does affect her value in their eyes. And so the protection is that you can't just do away with her as you please. Um, one of the things that, again, if we're talking about this in the context of trying to understand how to engage on this topic, I think the important thing to recognize here is not to let an apologist or someone defending this topic, defending the social institution in the Hebrew Bible, it's to not let them stay focused on the softer quote unquote forms, right?
Yeah.
Even though they're not soft. Uh,
Right.
it's to say, look, let's deal with chattel slavery, right? So if you look at obviously the sort of quintessential verse or a set of verses on slavery, chattel slavery in the Hebrew Bible, or Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, there it says if you want slaves, get them from the nations around you, get them from tenant farmers living in your midst, and their children that have produced in their land, in your land. They'll become your property, and that is inheritable property. They're passed on to your children as inheritance. They serve forever, right? That's that's difficult to shrug off. And there are apologetic arguments that people try to use. They're nonsense, but they try to use them. Uh, one of them that is becoming more and more frequent, much to my chagrin, is that, well, foreigners couldn't survive in Israel without being
Yeah.
attached to a family.
Right.
Miss me with that shit, to
Yeah.
quote Joel Baden. Because if you read verses 47, the very next verse and following, it says, if there is a Toshav living in your land, a foreign tenant farmer living in your land, and he becomes extremely wealthy, so much
Yeah.
so that he can buy other Israelites as his own slaves, here's what you do. So, you
Right.
know, it's just so much nonsense. But this is the key, I think, is to understand that debt slavery is not great. Indentured servitude is not great. It's awful, but it's still not the only kind of slavery that's in the Hebrew Bible that is endorsed.
No. Yeah, I mean that's absolutely it. And I think one of the things that you've been hitting on a lot and that we've been discussing is this sort of idea that you're regulating on behalf of the vulnerable, which was an extremely common thing. One of the I think I don't remember who talks about it. I'll look in my notes afterwards. Apologies to any scholars I miss if I'm paraphrasing your work. But something that's really common in these law codes is this kind of what I think I've seen described as a trilogy that you also see in the Bible of you're to take care of the poor, the orphan, and the widow. Now,
Yep.
this goes back, I think. I'm not sure how much further past Hammurabi, but it goes back, I think, to some of the earliest ones. These people understood, there's something I'm trying to always push back on in this show is for people to understand these are not primitive people. They have some
right.
things about them that are I would say less sophisticated, less complex in their social institutions. Certainly, to that extent, you could call that primitive. But these are thinking, breathing humans, reasoning people, and they recognize in moments of lucidity that these things happen. That orphans, widows, and poor are very vulnerable, and these kings always talk, and this is not just something the Bible does. So if it came from Yahweh, it certainly seems to have come from Marduk and Baal and everyone else too, is this idea that you are to take care of the poor, essentially, of the unfortunate, of the disadvantaged and marginalized. It is behind a lot of the social justice rhetoric, but that does not mean it's the reality. I don't know of a civilization that doesn't at least try to portray itself that way. Again, literally, I mean, to paraphrase the movie Killing Them Softly, Thomas Jefferson uh, wrote, "All men are created equal," and then went home and fucked his slave, and raped her. It like that is reality. And in for another example, in America, in the late 19th century, you had people start caring about things like animal rights. People started realizing that kind of cruelty, or at least enough people were willing to speak out about their discomfort with the cruelty towards animals. And this is really fucked up. That was the legal argument to give children rights beyond the property establishment that you see going back again into antiquity, into these laws. The reason you could sell children was because they were your property in these ancient Near East law codes. That didn't really go away. That didn't go away basically until way later than you might think. And the kind of screwed up law had to go around to seeing their humanity as people, had to bring in view that they were animals and were at least entitled to the rights of animals. And that is kind of where I think something that you're putting out there that I really want to hammer home with that perspective is that that's how women are treated in this. They
Mm.
are frankly treated in a way that they have these limited rights that in some ways are far less than men. They are considered essentially lesser. Same thing with children. They are considered lesser in some ways. They didn't conceive of these things necessarily by writing out, okay, here's the top of the ladder, the rich, the king, the god. You can see some of that. They don't always put it so bluntly, but you can see these clear divisions in the treatment of different people, depending on these kind of social prejudices that exist on your status, your sex, your age, your social status. That's kind of how we've always organized these things. It's usually unwritten, but it's there.
Yeah, I mean, there is no test for the unfaithful husband, in like the
Right.
second part of Numbers 5, right? That doesn't exist. This is a test for an unfaithful wife. Adultery is a married or betrothed woman who is having sex outside of her relationship, right? It's not a married man having sex outside of his relationship, his marriage, unless it's with another married woman. And then but because it's a crime against a man. That's what it is. And the person that owns or controls the rights to her sexuality. And yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on. And again, the clearest example, I think, one of the clearest examples of this, besides places like Deuteronomy 22:28-29, where a virgin girl that gets raped is to marry her rapist, right? Like it's not like they go to her and say, "Would you like to marry your rapist?" "Oh, you
Yeah.
would. Okay, great. Here, let's do that." No, and but I think probably the clearest example of this is outside of Exodus 21, 7 through 11, there's no choice, there's no consent considered there. Is that Deuteronomy 21, 10 to 14, the passage about the captive bride, right? This is not a text that says, if you see among the captives a beautiful woman and you ask her to marry you on one knee,
Yeah.
even if it did, even if it did, this is a captive woman. There is no way to get away from duress here. You can't do it. She cannot consent.
The social pressure is is more than most people could possibly imagine. So what we find is that the reality on the ground is fairly unknown, but it's not going too far to say that it was probably pretty awful for the chattel slaves and the debt slaves of the entire period of biblical history, and seems to have been a very similar systems to surrounding cultures as much as we can reconstruct them. And that goes pretty deep into the history of these books. It's not only confined to the monarchic period. For an example of how one Second Temple author thought about slaves after the exile, we can briefly turn to the quote-unquote wisdom book of Sirach, considered to be part of the Deuterocanon in most non-Protestant Christian traditions. The book, also known as Ecclesiasticus or Ben Sirah, was written in the early 2nd century by a man named Jesus ben Sirah, and was later redacted, translated into Greek, and expanded on by his grandson. And it's this version, the Greek version, that would remain important to Greek-speaking Jews and Christians for centuries, even down to today. Portions of the original Hebrew version were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and elsewhere, allowing scholars to get a pretty good idea of where the changes and expansions were made in the Greek. In this fascinating book, among pretty standard Second Temple proverbs, a retelling of many of the events of the Bible, and some pretty rampant misogyny, we find instructions about how to treat slaves. From chapter 7, quote, "Do not abuse slaves who work faithfully, or hired laborers who give of themselves. Let your soul love intelligent slaves. Do not withhold from them their freedom." All right, so far so good. In chapter 33, however, we get a whole pericope dedicated to what proper treatment of slaves looks like. Quote, "Fodder and a stick and burdens for a donkey, bread and discipline and work for a slave. Set your slaves to work, and you will find rest. Leave their hands idle, and they will seek liberty. Yoke and strap will bow the neck. And for wicked slaves there are racks and tortures. Put them to work in order that they may not be idle, for idleness teaches much evil. Set them to work as is fitting for them, and if they do not obey, make their fetters heavy. Do not be overbearing toward anyone, and do nothing without deliberation. If you have but one slave, treat him like yourself, because you have bought him with blood. If you have but one slave, treat him like a brother, for you will need him as you need your life. If you ill-treat him, and he leaves you and runs away, which way will you go to seek him?" So there we get all of the contradictions and conflict that undergirds slavery, an exhortation to treat slaves like human beings, preceded by a comparison of a slave with a donkey, an admission that slaves want to be free and seek their own liberty, and a command to brutalize and torture slaves who disobey. As we discussed, laws are made out of quote-unquote compassion to protect the vulnerable party, but that doesn't mean that the societal structures truly adhere to these laws. That was true during the transatlantic slave trade, where laws were blatantly disregarded by slave owners, and it's been true in every form of slavery and indeed labor we've ever encountered in human history. It's true of labor laws today, where, in addition to the H-1B visa programs I talked about before, the exploitation of paid workers still goes on, as anyone who's worked a retail or restaurant job can attest to. Sure, you're legally guaranteed regular 10-minute breaks and a 30-minute unpaid lunch every 5 hours, and there are legal limits on how tips are supposed to be paid out, but wage and time theft from employees are absurdly common in the service industry. Legal writings today are supposed to be prescriptive to a degree that is far more binding than the idealistic texts we find in the ancient world, but they run into the same economic realities and power dynamics as they did then, and those with power are often shielded by their wealth from actually complying. So to summarize all of it, the Bible endorses slavery from cover to cover, even if some authors admit slavery seems to really suck for those who are slaves. It's considered something only fit for the other, and includes contemporary laws meant to limit the extremes of the practice, all the while never questioning the institution itself. These discussions are not exceptionally good or exceptionally bad or really exceptional at all. They're exactly what we would expect from the time and place these books were written. As Josh and I discussed, one of the narratives that has often given cover to saying the Bible doesn't endorse slavery as a normative practice is the story of the Exodus, where we noted that the prohibition on slavery was specifically extended to fellow Israelites and Judahites, not to foreigners who could be and likely were slaves. And in the two-parter on Akhenaten, we reviewed the reality on the ground in the Late Bronze Age Egypt period and how it doesn't line up with the Exodus at all. But other than the possibility of a small group of what would become Israelites escaping some kind of forced labor in Egypt or an Egyptian-controlled territory, what else inspired the Exodus stories in the Bible? And just what does it have to do with one of the early kings of Israel? Find out more on the next episode of the Bible Lore Podcast. Thank you so much for your time, Josh. The books are Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery, and The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, volumes 1 and 2. The website is digitalhammurabi.com. I think you're Digital Hammurabi on most social media, Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. Anything else you'd like to plug? Any books coming up? Anything? I know you also read Hebrew with Dr. Kip Davis on YouTube pretty regularly if you want to learn Hebrew.
I'm writing a commentary currently on the book of Leviticus. So that's it's actually really, hate to say my own work is interesting. The book itself is incredibly interesting.
Leviticus is frankly one of the most tedious parts of the Bible, and anyone who tells you otherwise, that's a good way to detect if someone is lying to you.
That's right. That's
so
right.
if you're able to spin that into gold, I'm reading. You got a title or estimated release date?
I mean, I want to get it out at at the latest by the end of next year. I've been working on it for 7 months, but I'm thinking about going. We were going to self-publish it because that's how we make money.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about going with maybe Sheffield Press to have them publish it, just because they have some really cool commentary series that are for younger scholars, and so we'll see. But yeah, that would be my hope. But I always plug Megan, because if there's anybody that doesn't know or remember, she is the host of Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus podcast,
That's
and
right.
she's much smarter than I am. So if you
That's
if
why
you think I'm good,
that's why I had her on first. No,
that's right.
no
That's
shade to
right.
you, but no,
No,
I just really appreciate both of the work both of you do, and yeah, thanks so much again for
of course,
giving me your time. So,
of course.
cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, mate.
You can find his books, his YouTube channel, and much more at digitalhammurabi.com, and all of his links will be in the description for the show. Check out our full interview at patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast, where you can support the show for just $5 a month and get access to hours of bonus interviews. See you next time.
Well, they blew up a chicken